Welcome to Premise Podcast. This is your host, Angelos Sophocleous. In this episode, I host Constantinos Stylianou, a philosophy student at the University of Glasgow. We introduce the Ship of Theseus problem and analyze its relevance on object identity and personal identity. We have a discussion on the problem of personal identity, that is, what makes a person the person they are, examining different approaches to the problem. Lastly, we touch on the corpus problem and discuss spatiotemporal continuity before birth and after death. Welcome everyone to this week's episode. Today with me I have Constantinos Stylianou, who is an undergraduate in philosophy at the University of Glasgow. Welcome, Constantinos, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So today we will talk specifically about the Ship of Theseus problem and its challenges for identity and personal identity, as well as Leibniz identity of indiscernibles and different problems regarding personal identity, as well as solutions to the problem of the Ship of Theseus. Before we begin, Konstantinos, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself, about your research interests?
Yeah, as you said, I'm doing my undergrad at the University of Glasgow. I'm doing MA in philosophy, and mostly my interests lie in metaphysics, epistemology, and some like philosophy of science, philosophy of physics, stuff like that. But personal identity, it combines quite a lot of. It's a unique section, I think, and you can have interesting conversations. So yeah, I'm focusing on this today.
So starting, would you like to say what the Ship of Theseus problem is in philosophy? It's a problem which every first year undergraduate in philosophy comes to study, and this shows its importance in the whole field of philosophy. So what is the Ship of Theseus problem?
Yeah, so basically it's a story about the ancient Greek hero Theseus, who went on a ship to Crete, and then, other non-relevant details of the myth. He came back, and then, after all the journeys, after a lifetime of seafaring, the ship stayed at the harbor, and as it happens to every wooden ship back in the day, with the years passing by, the ship's planks, the oars, the masts, and so on, they became worn, and they were gradually replaced. And after enough time has passed, the ship that now sits at the harbor, let's call the original one S1, ship 1, let's say, and let's call the one that sits now at the harbor S2. And what's so special about S2 is that it shares no parts in common with the old ship, with the S1. And the point of this story, the questions it helps portray is the new ship S2. Is it the same as the old one S1? Is it still Theseus' ship? These are the questions, basically.
So it has all of its parts replaced, and we ask whether it has remained the same ship.
Exactly. Not a single piece of wood or any other thing that goes on in an ancient ship is the same. And you can start theorizing, let's say, as many philosophers throughout history did, about cases like these, and you can say that well, obviously it's not, right? It's not the same ship. It doesn't even have the same parts, so it can't possibly be the same ship. But then the further question that you can ask is, at what point did it stop being the same ship?
Mm-hmm.
Is it when the last plank was taken out, the last common, old plank was taken out and was replaced? But that seems too late, let's say, in the game to, to change the identity. If whatever, out of, let's say, 1,000 parts, 999 are the same, are new, and that one last one is still the same, is that enough to call it identity? Or on the other hand, if you take it too early, as many some people in the past may have said, that is it the moment you change one plank, is it no longer the same ship? Is it no longer the same vessel? And that's where the principle of identity of indiscernibles comes, because I think if we follow that principle, that's the last scenario that we said. That's the one that we would be forced, let's say, almost to accept.
And of course, this is not what common sense tells us. If we change all of the ship's parts or all of the parts of any object, common sense tells us that this is not really a different ship. If we renovate something, if all of our cells change, we're still the same person, for example. So there seems to be something more than just the parts of an object.
Yes, exactly. You can't just say that because you changed, I mean, not even going to personal identity, you can't just say that because you changed a plank or you changed some parts, because then you allow the criteria are so strict that basically any time, as you mentioned, like a cell in our body regenerates and is replaced by a new one, or in the case of the ship itself, the wooden planks, anytime they rot, or I mean, any small parts of them, then it's it obviously, like under this theory, let's say, it obviously isn't the same ship. It's something completely different because you have this new element, rot, or whatever it is, or rust for the metal parts. So as you said, is antithetical to the common sense that that's still the same ship. It's the ship of Theseus.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned before about Leibniz principle of the identity of indiscernibles.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind expanding on that and saying how it is relevant to the problem of the ship of Theseus?
Okay, so basically stated, let's say, out of context, and the as a mere like statement of the principle is that x is the same as y if and only if x and y have like all the same properties and relations. So in this case, whatever is true of x is also true of y, and the other way around. So it's relevant to the ship of Theseus problem, because when you're going to talk about is the new ship the same as the old ship, you're asking basically, are these two boats identical? And in discernibles, we'll ask, do they have exactly the same properties? Do they have exactly the same relations with anything else? So we can say, well, okay, S2, the new ship, sits at exactly the same spot that S1 used to occupy, and it still has the same owner. But actually, if you're gonna go in the components, if you're gonna talk about the properties of the ship, well, one has much newer planks, you know what I mean, than the other. One has a different oars or different masts or any other parts that make up a ship. So under this principle, these ships are not identical at all. And as we said before, if we trace down the point where under this principle where they stop being identical, it's not even when the first plank is replaced, it's when a new element, a new property, let's say, like rusty or rotten or any other sign of wear, let's say, appears on the ship. That moment, according to this, it's a very strong principle. So if we apply it to this problem, we yield like results that don't really agree with our intuitions and our, as you say, the common sense.
Mm-hmm. So just to go back to the problem again. So we have the original ship, S1, which has all of its parts replaced and becomes ship S2. And then in Thomas Hobbes' reformulation of the problem, Hobbes asks us to imagine someone taking all the old parts of the ship, all the parts of S1, which have been left in some warehouse somewhere, and building another ship, S3. So we now have ship S2, which is the replaced S1, but we also have ship S3, which is made by the parts of S1.
Yes.
So there seems to be the question of which of the two is the ship of Theseus. Is it the one that has its parts, or is it the one that seems to be continuous with
Yes,
S1?
exactly. I mean, they can't both be S1, obviously, because, we didn't really clone a ship all of a sudden. Like, even without, the principle of identity of indiscernibles, we clearly have two distinguishable things. They are discernible, as Leibniz would say. So they're clearly not identical to each other. So we must choose in this version of the story, let's say, we must choose which one it is that is identical to the original shape. So it all boils down to, as you said, is it the continuous process? So if I like this approach. I mean, is not as, let's say, philosophically, let's say, rigorous. But then, if somebody was to write the story, let's say, a book about the Ship of Theseus, would they just, would they start writing about all the years it spent under the command of Theseus in the sea and everything, and then would it stop with the last chapter saying, yeah, and it sat at the harbor, and that's it, just because a plank was changed? That would be a bit absurd, right? Like, it's still, like, as you said, it's a continuous process, and that continuous process, while if you see it at the two extremes, the time when S1 was sitting at the harbor and the time when S2 was sitting at the harbor, they seem radically different because they share no common parts, but it's still the same. It's still the same ship. It's the ship of Theseus. It's S2 that is the same. S3 shares the same parts and the same, let's say, like blueprint or something. It was built using the same parts and the same technique and process, let's say, as S1. But the fact that it was lying down in pieces at a warehouse for years, in my, you know what I mean, in my opinion, makes it like a brand new ship using old parts that uh, happen to have been comprising, S1 back in the day. You know what I mean? So that's what I would say in this case.
So yeah, the problem seems to be between two principles that have been mentioned in literature, specifically the gradual replacement principle and the same parts principle.
Exactly.
The gradual replacement principle states that if an object X is composed of many parts and a single part of that object is replaced producing object Y, then object Y and X are the same object. And then the same parts principle mentions that if X and Y have all and only the exact same parts arranged in exactly the same way, then X and Y are the same object. So according to the same parts principle, X1 is identical to X3. However, I agree with your point that there seems to be more than just the physical parts of an object making an object. It is continuity, it is the idea of that object. So
Yeah, exactly.
what exactly do you think is what gives an object its identity? Of course, it goes beyond its physical parts.
I wouldn't say it goes much beyond the physical parts. I wouldn't say it goes beyond the physical world, let's say, because I'm quite the physicalist, so I really don't want to appeal, especially later on when we start talking about personal identity. I really want to avoid any appeals to the existence of a soul or any other dualist, let's say, theories. If I was going to give you an answer when it comes to what gives an object its identity, it is the physical parts, but it's also the persistence in time. So if at any moment we define an object to be the ship of Theseus in this case, then following, as you said, the gradual replacement principle, and in general, like, if there is no gap, there is no lack of continuity, just like in the case of S3, where all the parts were sitting in a warehouse somewhere, one by one, you know what I mean, on a shelf, basically. Like that's the case where identity, let's say, remains. You know what I mean? That's when identity is a relation that you can meaningfully say exists between, you know, a ship in time one and a ship in time two, let's say.
Mm-hmm. So the basic argument is that the ship remains the ship it is because it has spatiotemporal continuity with
Exactly.
its future self.
Exactly. That's what I would say.
Would you believe though that there is this? So according to the best candidate theory, there are many candidates for being identical to the ship of Theseus, but only one is the best candidate. Do you believe that there are many candidates and what we consider to be identical to the original ship of Theseus is just the best one?
Well, in this case, it seems that that's exactly what's happening. Like you have two candidates that could be, and I think the wording is very important. Like that's how I would phrase it. I think there are two candidates that could be identical to S1, let's say, in this case S2 and S3, and it's a matter of which one I think is the best candidate. Not to make it too subjective in the sense of I think and you think, but it's the two principles that we stated before. So if I'm more prone to agree with the first one rather than the second one, I would go for the corresponding candidate, let's say. So yeah, I mean, I think if anything, this is like the simplest case, as in the simplest story that gives credence, let's say, to as you said, the best candidates approach, let's say.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a need to differentiate between the ship of Theseus and its parts. This is a distinction that was explicitly made by Hughes, who says that the central question is not really which of the two ships is identical to the original ship of Theseus, but the question is how is the ship of Theseus related to its parts? And I think that when we say ship of Theseus, we don't refer specifically to its parts, but to the history of the ship, to its captain, to the battles that it fought, to the stories that you can tell about the ship, as you mentioned before.
Yes, exactly. I wouldn't say like intuitively as well. At no point when you point at a person or at an object, at no point does any person think of just the parts, because as you said before, it's the way they're placed, it's their properties in general, and again, without trying to attribute any non-physical object, let's say, existing with the parts. That is that, you know what I mean? It's not that the ship of Theseus has some kind of soul or some kind of, almost like a platonic form situation. Like I wouldn't go that far, but for sure, objects are not just their parts, and our understanding of them as not just the sum of their parts is kind of critical in, well, you see it in everyday life. At no point, if somebody talks to you about a person or about a car, or in this case the ship, at no point will you picture the parts themselves just by themselves. You know what I mean? Like even us now, like having no, imagine if the ship of Theseus actually existed, like, and we had it in front of us, let's say in this case, like we lived back in the day, let's say, and we had no, just like we now, I presume, I don't know about you, but I certainly don't know anything about ship making, but I can understand the concept of the ship of Theseus, and I can see it and I can recognize it. If you see it, how it looks, I can recognize that this is the ship of Theseus without even knowing how many parts or what exactly its parts are. So, but identity in general and how we would, in the empirical sense of whether they are discernible, as we were talking before, we can understand which one is S2 and which one is S3, let's say, or the first one, when we call it Ship of Theseus, we can track down, even if we disagree or on the final, let's say, answer of which one is still the Ship of Theseus. At no point does any of us think of the Ship of Theseus as just the sum of its parts and nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But just to play a bit the devil's advocate here, I agree with you that the ship is more than its parts, and of course we don't mean anything particularly non-physical. I'm thinking that in the case of if we were to exhibit the Ship of Theseus at a museum, even though my intuitions tell me that the Ship of Theseus is not its physical part, is its ship S2. If someone were to ask me to choose which ship we are to exhibit in a museum, I would probably choose ship S3 because it's the ship that actually fought in those battles. It's the ship that had the history that it had. So yeah, I see a difference there between which is the original ship. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. I would definitely choose S3 in this case as well. I wouldn't think of, exhibiting. I mean, they would call it, like, if you go to museums, they say that this is a replica, or they say that this is a copy made, let's say, in many statues, in the cases of many, let's say, Greek statues, that we don't have the originals, let's say. But Romans saw the originals and they had the originals and they made copies of them. So there's many cases where you go at the museum and you see this is a Roman copy of the original Hellenistic or classical Greek statue or whatever. So I definitely agree. Like I wouldn't put this to and just call it Ship of Theseus, but I think that's a very context dependent, let's say, situation. You know what I mean? So in that sense, you are looking at the original Ship of Theseus, but because of the context of the museum and because of the, your mind definitely goes to, let's say, archaeology and the ancient history. But if we were to choose a different person, like a different ship, let's say, right? There's this ship, like I remember it still like exists somewhere in Greece, I think. It's called Averov, right? Like it's what was it, a First World War ship or a Second World War ship? I don't remember the history of it exactly. And it's kind of like a modern day Ship of Theseus, actually, if you think about it. It's somewhere like outside a museum, right? It's an exhibit as if it was, if it was small enough, let's say it would be housed inside a museum. I don't believe for a second that all its parts are exactly the same as the original. So again, I would go back to, if the context allowed me to go for continuity rather than a broken continuity but the same parts, I would still go for continuity. You know what I mean? So if somebody, let's say it's again, instead of a very like, it's been, if Theseus ever existed, or let's say the time that the Theseus myth happened, let's say it's somewhere around almost 3,000 years ago. So if we bring the story much closer to our time, you can see, there's people who have, I don't know, like, for example, a car collection, right? Like it's the car that they used to drive when they were kids and they still have it. It's clearly not the same. If we treat this as an analogy for a museum, you know what I mean? If somebody, I don't know, they were rich enough and they made a private collection of cars that they own and they used to drive. In that sense, I wouldn't ever, go make a complaint or something saying that, this is a fraud, this is not the actual car you used to drive because you changed its parts. So the context of the museum is not really the same. We're talking about different things, I think, here. If we enter the museum discussion, because there we're going for there we understand the identity in a different sense than what we understand than the way we understand it in pretty much every other context. Or maybe there are more exceptions that I can't think of right now, just like I didn't think of the museum before. But similarly, I think in most contexts in real life, let's say, outside very specific, let's call them exceptions in this case, I would still say that continuity matters, and that is, that's another, let's say, it's a property basically that makes something what it is. So that, as much if not more than having the same parts, plays a role, I think, in identity, and in this case, which is the answer to the Ship of Theseus, let's say, question.
It's true in all other, well, in most other cases we can say that it's continuity which ascribes an object with its identity, but it might be that in the case of the museum we see the problem historically, not that much in the present. So any object that we see at a museum, any original object that we see at a museum, it gains its importance because at some particular point in history, that object, those parts of that object, had some particular importance that couldn't be attributed if that object had different parts. So, yeah, the point of the museum is particularly interesting, I think, because it might be one of the few cases that we ascribe identity to the parts, the physical parts themselves. But you're right that we are taking a different approach here.
Yeah. As we said, like it's a special case where when you typically understand something to be the ship of, and I don't want to like reinterpret or add like too many imaginative details to the myth, let's say, as into the story, but let's say if the, like, I don't know how important the fact that the ship was actually sitting at the harbor is, because in the why is this relevant? I'm going to explain now. Is basically in the museum case, in the scenario, in the context of the museum, you care what you're going to call the Ship of Theseus, and you're going to go for S3 because, let's assume again, a historical personality. Somebody would say almost like a slogan now, like this is the wood, this is the ship that Theseus actually touched, right? This is the one that Theseus was actually placed in. While, again, not to change the myth, too much, but if the whole story of the Ship of Theseus is happening, like the transition from S1 to S2 when it sits at the harbor, is happening when Theseus is still alive, let's say. So if I'm changing the story enough to make it like, yes, we call S1 Ship of Theseus, but that S1 must clearly be different enough. Theseus must have made changes, let's say, or to the ship while he was using it. So even in the museum context, when you care, again, scare quotes, which ship did Theseus actually command or steer or whatever, or use, let's say, or travel in, then you in the previous version you would go for S3. But if Theseus is alive during this whole process, so if we move the idea of it, instead of just sitting at the harbor, is just Theseus making the changes himself slowly and gradually, then obviously the ship he has at the end is the same as it's still his ship. He made gradual changes, and that's what I meant before when I mentioned the cars, right? If I used to drive a car when I was a kid, and then I just took the parts out one by one, and by the end the parts are all new, but I made those changes and they were gradual, I would show it. I would show that in my, let's say, fictional car collection museum situation that I just thought of. I wouldn't, even if I kept somewhere as spare parts or as somewhere in a warehouse, even if I had all the scraps and all the the parts, the individual parts that I had replaced of my car, I wouldn't reassemble them years later or decades later and show that to be my car. You know what I mean? Unless, again, the context is so specific that I actually need that for some reason. In the case of the museum, is, let's say, historical accuracy, which I kind of paraphrased in the slogan, which one did Theseus actually step on? You know what I mean? Which one did he travel in, or which one did he command? But again, not to change the myth all of a sudden, but as in the story of the Ship of Theseus, all of a sudden, I think if we assume that Theseus was making the changes, as happens with everyone, like we make changes to whether it's furniture or in this case vehicles and stuff like that, like gradually, while you have any vehicle or any object, you will make some changes, but it still remains the same object. It still remains the same. It still has its identity. That's what I would say.
Yeah, it seems to make a difference if Theseus is still alive and the ship is not just a historical object, but is an object we presently use and make changes in its identity.
Exactly.
Now I'd like to move on to the problem of personal identity. We have set basis for this discussion on the Ship of Theseus, and it seems to be highly relevant to the problem of personal identity. That is, what makes you you? What makes you the person you are? Is it your memories, your physical body, your knowledge, your parents? Could you set out the problem for us and how the Ship of Theseus problem is relevant to the problem of personal identity?
Yeah, so I would say that no matter what anybody's answer to the previous question, if we accept, or if we all agree, let's say, on the fact that time actually flows, let's say, and goes by, and that we persist in it in some way, whether we are identical to our future selves or not, that's, let's call them details for now. We all, you can see the parallels between the Ship of Theseus and any question about personal identity immediately. The only, let's say, extra, additional thing that we might have is, consciousness or, self-cognition and memories and all that. A ship wouldn't have memories in the sense of the wood itself wouldn't have them, but we have them. So the parallel, as I said, is, if we actually translate it to a person, let's say, I used to be a small child. I used to have this much height, whatever, like many different, biological facts about myself. These many liters of blood in my body, these many cells in my body, or whatever, I don't know. And slowly you grow up, slowly people, tend to become taller. Little by little, our cells die out and they basically kind of like regenerate and they are replaced by newer cells. There's this myth for the 7 years situation. It's not exactly accurate, but still. So different parts of a body, let's assume, a period of time passed, almost not a single cell in my body is the same as the one it used to be in the previous, like before the period of time passed. So similarly, I am S2 in that sense. Am I the same as S1? So that is the parallel. If essentially we're asking the same questions. The only difference now is that the criteria and the approach, let's say, as people call them, the approaches might be different in the sense of, as we had the museum approach and the common sense / real life approach, or the whether Theseus was alive or not. Now the approaches are slightly different, but essentially we're dealing with the same facts or the same data, let's say, and we're trying to figure out the same kind of relation, some identity, right? So in this case, like as in this sense, the Ship of Theseus will, let's say, almost help us or inform our views when it comes to personal identity, and we can always use it as as a way to make sure that we're not losing ourselves when it comes to the different phrasings or different new theories or new data or new thought experiments as they come out. We can always kind of fall back to the Ship of Theseus and translate this new case to the Ship of Theseus just to see that we're all on the same page and everything. I think that's why it's important.
Mm-hmm. So in the Ship of Theseus problem, we said that a response to the problem is to say that a ship is more than its physical parts. That says about the ship's historical significance and past. So in the problem of personal identity, what do you personally think that is what gives a person her or his identity?
Basically, the question now becomes like the question of personal identity. If we're going to formalize it, is something like, if something is a person at one time, under what circumstances, what are the possible circumstances for something that exists at another time, let's say in the future, identical to the first one, right? So again, it's the same as the Ship of Theseus. And the two main approaches that I kind of, there's merit in both, and not to just stand in the middle. I do find myself a bit more of a physicalist, let's say, an animalist, as it's called. Where the two approaches are, one is called the psychological approach and the other is called the biological approach. Psychological approach says that for one, I don't know, let's call him Thomas for now, right? So for a person that is in the future to be identical as the person that was in the past, and his name was Thomas, so for the person in the future to be Thomas, there must be some correct, some agreed upon, let's say, some relevant and significant psychological continuity between that that object or that person in the future and Thomas in the past. So in these cases, as you mentioned, there's consciousness, there's memories, there's all these things that are not purely, they're not just parts. It's not like, even if we have parts of our brain that control, let's say, when it comes to like consciousness, memories, and all that, it's not that memory is an organ. You know what I mean? It's not that it's a as we when we were talking before about parts and about planks and all that. It's not memory is a plank. It's a physical object, tangible, let's say, physical object. It's more of a property or some other thing that matters when it comes to personal identity. And common sense and intuitively that obviously makes sense, but there's many cases that I would disagree with the psychological approach. Let's say the people who take the psychological approach, because if you think about it, like, we tend to forget many things. So if something happened to me, like, I don't know, in the far past, right, like decades ago, and I really have no recollection of it, then how can I be that person? How can I be if back in the day, let's say, I used to be a very good footballer, let's say, or whatever, and now I am certainly not, how can I be the same person in that sense? And that seems a bit trivial, but obviously there's cases of amnesia, there's, all those cases that you can truly say that, this person is not who they used to be. You know what I mean? Even if we say it as a phrase, let's say, you're not who you used to be, or this person wasn't who they used to be, it's not like they're still the same person, right? Like they're still, whatever, in this case, Thomas, right? It's still Thomas, even if Thomas doesn't remember his own name. Or similarly, when it comes to consciousness, what about every time we're not conscious, right? So if we go something drastic, is the coma, like amnesia, let's say. If somebody's in a coma, they don't stop being that person. They're still, your relative or whoever it is. And then there's also, like, my favorite example is actually like when you're asleep, right? Like, so every night we go to sleep and we're kind of not conscious. So if something happens to us while we're asleep, it still happened to us, right? Like, you can't say it didn't happen to you, it happened to somebody else, just because that person has no psychological continuity. You're clearly different, let's say, people psychologically, but as in, no, you're not different people, but it's clearly two different, let's say, entities, the two different objects, but we would say it's still the same person. So these are, let's say, my problems with it.
Mm-hmm. So psychological continuity focuses on memory and the personality of an individual.
Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, we have the biological approach,
yes,
which takes, let's say, the way I understand it is that, and what I agree with it in that sense, is that we are the human animals, right? Like we are, members of the species Homo sapiens. So we are an organism, we're a full thing, and that this is who we are. This is what makes us who we are. So Constantinos is Constantinos because, let's say, not in the sense of causality, but Constantinos at time t2 is Constantinos at time t1 because Constantinos is still the same organism, is still the same member of the same species. So even if, and again, turning back to the Ship of Theseus, even if our cells regenerate and even if our cells change, or even if we take it something drastic, and we can talk about it a bit more in detail later, even if I lose an arm or somebody lost a leg or anything like that, it's still the same person. You can't possibly say that, it's not the same person because they lost a limb. So that's not, so when we say that, identity, like we take humans as organisms, so the whole of it, let's say, matters, it doesn't mean that just like the Ship of Theseus, every part that, every time we lose a part, it means it's a different ship. Similarly with people, let's say, or any other animal, to be honest. And that's one of the things, by the way, I forgot to mention. Many of the people who take the, let's say, the biological approach, they would say something along the lines that personal identity is not too different from, let's say, the identity of a non-human animal, let's say of a dog. It's still the same dog, let's say. So because they don't, consciousness or memories or anything like that, depending on your views on whatever one of these and, at what level of, from object to personhood, let's say, animals are. By somebody who agrees to the biological approach doesn't care about any of these because psychological continuity doesn't answer to them. So personal is purely an organism kind of issue. So there we go. These are basically, in a nutshell, we can go, obviously, we will go in more details, but these are like very brief summaries of each view as I see them.
How much focus should we give on the physical body, though? I'm thinking if we could in some way upload our personality and consciousness and everything non-bodily in some sort of machine and then download it to another body, would you say that we are still the same person?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly where I stand in that because, as we'll see a bit later, I wouldn't say I do agree that in some weird science fiction way, it's kind of it should be possible, let's say, for us to do that, as in to manage to transcode almost or translate all of our brain functions, let's say, as just electrical signals or whatever data that we can upload on a computer or another body or even just a server, let's say, so that in an even more science fiction way we just exist on the internet or anything like that. But I think that would still be you, but as in I'm tempted to say that would still be you, but I think the brain itself has to matter, at least the brain, if nothing else. So obviously that kind of goes against the biological continuity that I was talking about before, as in the biological approach. And I think that's where I think this philosopher Eric Olson kind of fits in the conversation because he tried to find a compromise, let's say, between the psychological, let's say, approach people and the biological approach people. So I don't know exactly how to, because like I've given many answers in the past on this, and I almost like flip-flopped, let's say, many times on this, and I don't know exactly how to, fine-tune any theory that I might have on it. I think, yeah, like on the one hand, I'm tempted to say that new person, let's say, after a purely computational transplant, let's say, of whatever it is, I would say that it wouldn't be identity. You know what I mean? You wouldn't transfer identity like that. So even if that person, let's say, might even have my own memories or anything like that, it wouldn't be me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I think although we will come back later, I think it should definitely, it will become a theme in the conversation, actually. I do like to mention movies or pieces of other pieces of literature, let's say, when it comes to arguments like these, because it's so much easier for everybody to understand what you mean. So in the movie, so as uploading, let's say, the contents of a mind, let's say, of a brain on a server, that's the movie Transcendence. And when I watched it, I did think that that's plausible. But actually, it's another movie called The Prestige by Christopher Nolan, which deals with, let's say, cloning. It's a bit more like cloning rather than, transferring consciousness. But I think that matters more, and that's why I'm taking more of the biological approach here. When what's his name, Angier, I think, right? When Angier, played by Hugh Jackman, when he would enter the supposedly Nikola Tesla's device, there would be two of them at the end of this process, but only one, like the continuity, which again is quite important to me. The continuity is the key. So only one of them had that exact continuity. You know what I mean? So while both of them were, you can, I mean, we can debate that, but let's say both of them were people and both of them were like fully functional, perfect copies of each other. Only one of them contained, you know what I mean? If I woke up, if I went through that process, only one of those two bodies, it would be me. The other would be another, let's say, Constantinos. It would be another kind of person. But you know what I mean? Like the continuity would break for one of them. You can, you know what I mean? You wouldn't exist in both. Much like, again, just to take it back, much like the Ship of Theseus couldn't be both S2 and S3. So I would always go with the continuity, let's say, side. And in this case, it's the biological, in the sense of only one of them would be me, and only one of them would be the original that I started with, and the other would just be a clone. Okay, so when it comes to transferring, let's say, data from one brain and kind of, let's say, uploading, let's say, them into another, erasing any previous data, let's say, so that we achieve some kind of maybe psychological continuity, I would still say that this is not really exactly what it is. Maybe it would be different. And again, that's why I think I like the biological approach more, or at least Olson's view of the biological approach. Maybe if it was a brain transplant, maybe that would work. So if instead of uploading, let's say, some form of like memories or anything, if we actually got a full brain of a person, so all the physical parts with all the non-physical, like, memories and all that, and we manage somehow to fully transplant it into another person, make perfect, compatibility and all that, and other medical issues that are not relevant to us right now. Maybe that would be the same person in just a new body. You know what I mean? Just like when you lose a limb and you put a prosthetic one, let's say, it feels weird and it feels like a new thing, but it's still you. It doesn't change. So I think the limit, I would still place the brain as the, let's say, the limiting factor. So if the brain exists, if the brain is the same in between the two, not the contents or in the sense of the memories or anything, if the brain is the same with obviously the memories as well, that way you can achieve, I think, this transplant with the new person being, let's say, the same as the previous one.
And coming from a phenomenological perspective, I agree that that wouldn't be the same person in a new body, because another body gives you another way to experience the world, a totally different way to experience the world and yourself, of course. The way we experience the world, it's not just our brain, but it's more than that, in the sense that our body, which gives us access to the world, allows us to experience the world in different ways. Of course, we see our brains as the primary means of having access to the world, but people's experience of the world differs even when we compare to people's bodies. Two people have different experiences of the world merely because of their different physical bodies.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Although personally, that's when we're going to start to disagree. Let's say, I wouldn't. I would obviously, if even if we accept or agree, or even if in my case, let's say I would agree that a brain transplant would actually transfer identity from a person who looked like me to a person with a different body, let's say, but it's still me. I understand and I agree that it will be a different experience, but I don't think that matters. Like, if anything, I do think that the brain is pretty much all there is in that sense. Like, not to steer the conversation too far, like from what we're talking about and making to full phenomenology, but I think what you're saying is basically, so would you say that if identity is affected by your experiences in the phenomenological sense, like how you experience the world, and that, would you say that if somebody turns blind or deaf, or the other way around, like you see it all over the news, people who were blind and now they can see, or they are deaf and now they can hear, would you say that they're not the same person? Obviously their experiences are different, and in the idiomatic sense, they're not the same person anymore. But would you say that identity doesn't hold between them?
I wouldn't take it that far, no.
Okay.
Of course, in the everyday sense, we say, "Oh, this experience changed me,"
Yeah,
or
yeah, obviously.
"I am a different person." But identity-wise, it's not the same as when we're saying, "Well, I'm not the same person with the person that I was 20 years ago."
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the everyday sense, I'm not. We have, if we list our properties, probably we have. It's difficult to find anything
In
anything
common,
in
right?
common.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there
Okay,
is.
so you wouldn't take it that far, yeah?
I wouldn't. Yeah,
Okay.
your experience has changed, but identity-wise, you still are the same person.
Okay. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, it's just because when you mention phenomenology, and I know that this is, like, let's say, your area, and I just wanted to, like, pinpoint, let's say, where exactly you stand when it comes to the
Yeah.
identity and how much it relates.
Mm-hmm. Before closing, I would like to discuss the corpse problem and its relation to the problem of personal identity.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the corpse problem?
So basically, the way I was introduced to it was basically through this philosopher that I was talking about before, also, right? So he gave this argument. It was I'm only saying this because I think, like, context, like, we need some context before I just drop in the formulation of the corpse problem. With the psychological continuity, let's say, one of the other problems, let's say, the other objections that people have, apart from the lack of continuity in memory or consciousness and all that, even in our everyday lives, or in more extreme cases like coma or amnesia and all that, there is this other scenario, equally science fiction to everything as we've been discussing, as in to other things we discussed before, which is the case of fission, right? So imagine a future where you can actually transplant brains and all that. And what if we actually split a brain in half? And again, we're not going to deal with the exact science, but let's say one hemisphere goes in one person, the other goes in another. I don't know exactly how the science would work, but in that case, it seems like there's two resulting people. It doesn't mean that it was you, or there's identity involved, but the idea is that this gives rise, let's say, when you try to take the psychological approach, to talk about these issues and to talk where, if any, is identity preserved. You get to the problem of the too many thinkers, let's say, problem, in the idea that people say that just like, let's say, two roads or two rivers might at some point merge and become one and then diverge again, so too, let's say, if somewhere in my future a fission happens, so if this is the case, then where I am now and where I, where my body is right now, let's say, there's actually two of us. It's not just one Constantinos, it's two, because at some point in the future, and only at some point in the future will we be separated. And Olson gave this argument that basically says that if I'm not an animal, so if I'm not an organism, if the biological approach doesn't matter, right? So if I'm not an animal, then there are two of us thinking right now. And since, again, because he disagrees with this, right? He says, since there aren't two of us thinking my thoughts, I am the animal. It's just one of us thinking. So the corpse problem features in this because when Olson talks about the biological continuity, right? So the continuation of some bodily functions, metabolism, or like internal temperatures, or eye movements, eye coordinations between the brain, or anything like that, as in the capability of the brain to control any limbs or any available, let's say, other organs like eyes and all that. That's the biological continuity that Olson is talking about. So the corpse problem says that, okay, but something that is definitely not biologically continuous to me is basically my corpse, right? It definitely doesn't have, it definitely doesn't have any wake-sleep cycle. It doesn't have any metabolism. It doesn't have anything like that. It's not a living organism. So of course it cannot be identical to me, can it? So in Olson's case, as in Olson's view, Olson's view differs, let's say, from the intuitive position of this person, like my grandmother or something, like she died or something. Well, it's not really like that. Like her corpse is not really my grandmother. It's not at all my grandmother, Olson would say, because there is, no biological continuity between them. So this is a problem because, according to Olson, would say, like we can never be a corpse, right? Like we can never become a corpse. So I would say that kind of the corpse problem places, let's say, a trilemma, if you will, three possible options, let's say, for Olson, or for anybody who agrees with Olson even enough to take the biological approach, let's say. So you would say that, when I die, I will go out of existence, right? Because, that's the end of me. And then I will be kind of almost like instantly replaced by a brand new object, the corpse that wasn't there before at all. Because if it was, then we would have the multiple fingers, let's say, problem that he wants to avoid. And, that seems a bit weird. Like, who places the corpse there? You know what I mean? How does it, how am I replaced by a corpse all of a sudden? Or by this thing that we call a corpse? Then there's the other option where you say that when I die, I'll go out of existence, and the particles that used to compose me, they will not compose anything metaphysically. You can't even call it anything. It's just a lump of cells or any other categorization of particles, right? You can't even call it a corpse. That's the other option. And the third option, which is again like the opposite of what Olson was saying, is that before, during my life, before my death, I share space and I share matter with this non-living entity that one day will be my corpse, but it's been distinct from me. And that's a weird, that's a weird option to take. So Olson actually, despite it sounding a bit weird, he actually goes for the second option, right? After a person dies, the matter, the physical matter that used to comprise the body, it does not like compose anything now, not even something that we could call a corpse, let alone that person's corpse. So this is basically like the corpse problem is basically designed to make people just like the amnesia problem or the dreaming, let's say, or the coma and all that are designed to make the people who take the psychological approach admit or conclude something that is really unfavorable or undesirable when it comes to our intuitions and our everyday lives. The corpse problem is pretty much the exact same thing when it comes to the biological approach, because it's a weird position to take, that if you die, then that thing that stays, like, it's not even a thing, it's nothing, it's just a bunch of cells, let's say. You can't even call it a corpse, you can call it my corpse, or the person who died. It's an unnatural, it seems unnatural, let's say, this conclusion. So that's basically the corpse problem in a nutshell.
Would you say that there's any kind of continuity between your living self and your corpse?
Yes, I would say that, because if you take this, okay, let me say it in simple terms first. There is, because it's not like a coincidence. It's not a mistake that when people die, like we see, and it's their corpse, right? Like, the phrasing is very important here. So
their physical body.
Yeah, but it's there because there is some continuity. If there was no continuity, it would be just what they just look like it. You know what I mean? It's not. That's why the first option seems even weird, that it's been replaced, right? Because when you say, like, there must be some kind of continuity, not one that would call for identity or anything, but there's definitely quite a lot of continuity between a person right before death and right after death, because it's not some foreign object that just so happens to look exactly like what the person looked right before they died. You know what I mean? Like, unless you accept the first option from before, that magically, a dying person is replaced upon death by this completely new and foreign, let's say, object that is a corpse. And even then, I would say it's not even their corpse, it's a new foreign object, right? So if we say that somebody died and that's their corpse right there, that denotes, in a very simple way, like a continuity. And the philosophical theory behind it, I would say, it's more of it's not a different approach in the sense of psychological and biological. It's an approach when it comes to time, actually. And we can talk about that if you want, because I think it's very interesting.
Of course.
So it's basically roughly called, let's say, four-dimensionalism. It's just there's many forms of four-dimensionalism. That basically says, there's the three spatial dimensions and there's the temporal dimension, right? And just as we have height, width, and depth, these are the three spatial dimensions, right? And we persist in all of them. We're not like infinitely thin piece of paper with 2 dimensions, right? Like, we have all three, and we can freely move in them, unlike time, let's say. We can't really time travel like that, but we do persist in all 4 of them. We persist in time because this body, let's say, that I have exists. Yes, it changes forms, but the theory that I'm going to talk about now, as in the fourth dimensionalist approach, let's say, that I'm going to talk about now, possibly solves this idea of change and the whole Ship of Theseus idea. It's one body that persists through time. So fourth dimensionalist theory is kind of, it's not like a physical theory that bundles up many dimensions, but in this case, it just thinks of objects as, many people call it like the worm theory, because it's almost as if it's a person and there's many of them, let's say, 3-dimensional cross sections of this fourth dimensional body that moves in time like a worm, right? So, it's a bit hard to visualize just by me talking, rather than actually having maybe like a diagram or anything. But it's a very, it's an intuitive thing in that sense. Especially if you see it, in a picture. But if I was going to go through with it, as in with this theory, I would say, you introduce this concept of the instance or the instantiation of a property, right? So the color of the chair that I'm sitting on, let's say, is an instantiation of blueness, right? So once you start talking with this kind of language, and as in using these kind of terms to describe things, you maybe solve many issues, I think. So if you accept that instantiations like this, they come in episodes, right? So episodes are like events, an event in time, but an episode actually has an extension in time, right? So an event in this sense is instantaneous. It happens once and that's it. It has no duration. But if it has a duration, it's called an episode. So if you apply these two, let's say, properties, these two terms that we just, let's say, introduced, the instantiation and the episodes, then we have as what is called the episodic characterization, right, of time or of persistent objects. So you would say that even if the chair that I'm sitting on, if I paint it orange, it's only the instance of blueness that will end, and the instance of orangeness will begin, but the chair persists throughout. It's still the same episode, right? So when you use this framework and you take it to the personal identity, you talk, you're searching, because if you remember from before, we're searching for the circumstances that make one person the same as the previous. Well, now you're just using almost like a different language, right? Like we're looking for the circumstances under which, let's say, how's it called? Like an instance of personhood, let's say at time one, is part of the same episode of personhood as an instance of personhood at time two. So it seems like, jargon, a heavy language, but it's very easy to visualize, I find. I mean, maybe because I have some science background, like physics and stuff, but I think it's very, like, it helps a lot, because basically the continuity that I was describing for the corpse is very easily described with this, right? So the instance of personhood of me, let's say, now is the same as the instance of personhood of me up until I die. Afterwards, it's not the same. So obviously I'm not identical to my body. I'm not my body, because my body is, as in my corpse, let's say, is dead. It's not going to be me. But there is this episode underneath, and that episode in the biological approach would be something like the body, right? So there's this episode that goes underneath, and that's the same, right? So that's what provides the continuity in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you think about stuff like that, you can take the corpse problem. There's people who take the corpse problem like even further, and I don't know if they call it the resurrection problem, but it's basically something similar, right? So you can imagine you basically do a parallel of the corpse problem with the Ship of Theseus, right? So there's me, and then when I die, there's the corpse, and also would say that the corpse is nothing. Like you can't even call it a corpse, let alone my corpse. But what if, let's say, in some, again, science fictional, let's say, future, you can preserve bodies, and then you can somehow, let's say, reanimate them later. You can, because let's say somebody died young, right? And let's say somebody didn't die because of natural causes, but they died because of, let's say, an accident or anything like that. They drowned, I don't know, something like that. So let's say at some point in the future, doctors, let's say, of the future, or anybody like that, they can reanimate somebody. They can make the heart beat again. They can make the brain regulate all the biological functions, which is what also would require, let's say, for identity to be preserved. Doesn't mean they have to be the same processes, but at least there are enough processes for this thing to be called a person now, right? So if my body is preserved in such a perfect condition, and then at some point in the future, it might compose another living person, let's call it whatever, like Thomas again, right? Then we can, let's say, conclude two things from this, right? We can all agree that me and Thomas will be different people, because it's not going to be the same thing. It's going to be completely different. It's not it's a reanimation of the body, but it's not a resurrection in the traditional sense, right? It's not me. It's not going to be me, because the organs will be different, just like with the Ship of Theseus, right? Like the parts might be different.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, the parts might be the same, but there's this huge gap that allows for no continuity between me when I was alive and whatever that thing is when it gets reanimated. So the problem for Olson with this further, let's say, resurrection, now let's call it rather than corpse problem, is that the second thing that you can infer from this, let's say, story is that there is one thing, right? There is that one thing that used to be me, and now it's Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
As in, there used to be this body, this something that houses me, and is kind of identical to me, unless we go to the too many thinkers problem. And then later it houses this Joseph. So without going to dualism, because as I said, like I really don't want that, the fourth dimensionalist vocabulary, let's say, allows you to explain this, right? So you can say that it's basically saying that there is this one thing, this one episode that continues throughout, but it's not an episode of personhood. That's why the instance of personhood before I died, which is me, is not the same as the instance of personhood later with this guy Thomas, but the episode underneath, which is not necessarily, it's not just a synonym for my body, it's just the idea of a fourth dimensional, in this sense, body that persists through time, because my body persists, right? Because it was preserved. So that's why I think, like, if you add this episodic characterization, this episodic, let's say, vocabulary into biological approach, I think many of the problems of the Ship of Theseus, let's say, situation actually, it's not that they're solved, it's just that you have a stronger case to make for, why is S2 the same but not S3? You know what I mean? As the Ship of Theseus. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think that's my final, almost like, let's call it answer. It's not really an answer, but you know what I mean? That's the final theory, let's say, that I currently ascribe to.
Mm-hmm. Before closing, I would like to share a thought that I had about the corpse problem. I'm not sure if this has been touched in literature. So, of course, as it's called the corpse problem, it deals with what happens after death. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we can epistemically or metaphysically apply the same thinking to what happens before birth.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure some people talked about it, but I don't remember what they said. But we can improvise now.
Of course. So, as you mentioned, the three approaches to the corpse problem, some being that you just go out of existence and that corpse replaces you, but you still have some, we still want to say that you have some continuity with that corpse, cannot just go out of existence. So in saying that you cannot just come out of existence, how do we deal with someone coming out of existence? Do they have some...
I understand what you mean. So basically, I would say, so again, like, it's tempting, especially if you're a dualist, that's the point. That's when people, especially religious people and stuff, you can have in your arsenal almost this thing, the soul, right? The soul is what makes you who you are, is not really your body. So they can pinpoint, using any other, like method, whether it's scripture or any other argument, let's say if you're not a religious dualist, that, whether it's conception, any time during pregnancy or birth, at any point, soul enters, let's say, your body at this point, and that's it. That's when you come into existence all of a sudden. And in this case, it's almost like they solve their problem, right? Because they can say, well, yeah, there's no continuity before, just like with the corpse situation, because before it's just a body, it's just a lump of cells that we call a body, and it's foreign to you in the sense of what makes you, it's your soul, right? So it doesn't matter that you share the same body as that thing before, because that's not you. Just like with the corpse problem, I will share the body, like my body will be the corpse, but it won't be me, right? It's not going to be me. So in that sense, I don't care what happened, let's say, what happens to the corpse in this case, not in the actual real life, but you know what I mean? It's irrelevant, let's say, because it's not me. So when you talk about before birth, the option number one, where I go out of existence and I am weirdly, magically, let's say, instantly replaced by this new object that is the corpse that wasn't there before, that would be something similar to what a dualist would say in reverse, right? So there was this body that it has nothing to do with you in that sense. And then again, if you're a theist, let's say, then God will will place a soul in that body, and that's what makes you, right? It's the soul. But you can agree or disagree with it. There's people who agree. I certainly disagree with a reasoning like this. So I think that somebody like Olson would take the second option, just like before, right? But I think, I don't know exactly, to be honest. I don't want to attribute anything to him, but the equivalent of the course problem when it comes to birth, for the option that he takes for the course problem, would be something like the embryo up until the point that we decide that an embryo or a newborn or a zygote or whatever it's called is a person, depending on the criteria that we might have. Before that, before something meets that criteria for it to have some personal identity, it's just a lump of cells, right? It's just the particles, the cells that that compose the body that you will enter in the future. Just like in the course problem, it's the particles that previously made you that will not compose anything. I would say the mirror part would be something like before personal identity happens, before we can call this a person, before this person comes alive. And not to go into politics, but that would depend on each person's view, whether this is a conception somewhere during pregnancy or birth. Before that, then it's just a lump of cells. It's nothing. You can't even call it an embryo. You can't even call it making the parallels with the corpse, right? You can't call it an embryo. You can't call it anything. It's just a lump of cells. You can't even call it that it was I was my embryo, or it was my embryo, right? So I don't know how, like, what the repercussions, let's say, are when it comes to not necessarily political issues like abortion and all that, but exactly like at what point would anybody place the start of your life, however, whether you want to call it an episode or an instantiation or anything like that. Like, when it comes to death, it's much easier, let's say, to say, yeah, okay, this person died, let's deal with what are we going to talk about the continuity when it comes to the corpse. But I think it's just slightly a bit more complicated, I guess, because we don't know exactly, or each person, let's say, would give a different time as to when life actually begins. Although, to be fair, just before you say it, I did remember reading about it back in the day. I don't remember how that factored in the conversation, though. But I definitely remember something about it, like the mirror of a mirroring of the course problem when it comes to life, basically, the beginning of life rather than the ending of life.
Yeah, it seems relevant, because
Exactly.
if we want to say that that corpse is our corpse, and it's not just some other physical body that is just lying on the ground, and that is because we have some continuity with that corpse, and that used to be our physical body we have now, or the bones that make us will be our corpse's bones. But similarly, if we go back to birth, and of course strictly philosophically speaking, without making any political arguments, this raises a question as to how identical we are to the zygote that we were or even the sperm cell and the ovum that we were at some point, because we do have continuity with the sperm cell and the ovum that from which we came to be, as we have continuity with our future corpse.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like, there is certain, there is some continuity. And I think that's where the politics comes. But it's very interesting actually to see how philosophical theories can inform our opinions, and also like medicine as well when it comes to decisions like abortion, because actually your stance on what I was talking about before, like, because the corpse is not really mine, then I don't care, let's say, about it. How far you take this reasoning when you apply it to how far is it my embryo, or how far is it my zygote, or how much continuity, like how much relevant continuity exists, that will basically inform your opinion on abortion, right? That's in my head, like as in my opinion, that's pretty much what it is. Like if somebody thinks, for whatever reason, let's say if somebody like me, let's say, ascribes mostly to the biological approach, then it's just a matter of, when it comes to, is this thing, let's see what we're going to call it in a bit, but is this thing, let's say, inside the womb, is this a person, is it not, like what are the criteria? And and it's just, I think it's just a matter of degree of, and you see with where medics and biologists inform legislation just to where to place the limits on abortions and all that. They talk about biological continuity, right? Which is what we're talking about now. So when it's something like brain functions, or when it's something like heartbeats and all that. So I think is very telling when it comes to exactly what you're saying about before. Like, we've been talking about the corpse problem, but let's say the embryo problem, in that sense, not its problem, but you know what I mean. The embryo problem, for lack of a better name that I can't remember right now, is equally, if not more, relevant. So that's pretty much, yeah. I should go back and read it at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And the corpse problem raises a lot of there of topics that one could potentially discuss, such as necrophilia and harming dead people.
Yeah, exactly. So as I said, like, if I don't care what happens to my body, then what if like, does that mean that, let's say, when it comes to my parents or some, a friend or a relative, does it mean that you don't care what happens to your body? And then, given that we do care what happens to our friends or our relatives' bodies after they die, why is it that we care? What's the exact continuity? And as you said, when it comes to necrophilia, or just, what's it called, like sacrilege, or like, as in, people call it sacrilege if you ruin or do something, not necessarily in a sexual nature, let's say, but you do something to a corpse of somebody, even if, like, it's clearly not their father or their mother or their friend, right? It's clearly not their relative. The relative died, but the corpse that stays still has enough continuity that is not just, let's say, let's call it coldly, the irrational, let's say, emotional attachment that people have. It's something more than that, I would say. You know what I mean? So that's why that's what I would call a continuity.
Yeah, those are perhaps topics for another conversation, more political.
Yeah.
So, Constantinos, I would really like to thank you for your participation in the podcast.
Thank you very much, Angelos. It's been an amazing experience, and we can definitely find other interesting topics to discuss anytime in the future, anytime you want them.
Absolutely. All the best to you in your studies and in your research.
Thank you very much.
You have just listened to Premise Podcast. Subscribe to Premise Podcast on YouTube and make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook. The podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Soundcloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please consider supporting Premise Podcast on Patreon to help bring philosophy to the public. See you next week. Thanks for listening.